Hello, everybody. This video is going to cover chapter 8 that talks about emotion. So let me switch over to things and we'll get started. All right, here we go. So when we talk about emotion in interpersonal communication, we need to recognize that emotions are your body's multidimensional response to any event that ultimately enhances or inhibits your goals as you see them. You need to also differentiate emotion from mood because they are different. Emotion has a specific cause where mood does not. You can't necessarily come up with a reason for why you're in a bad mood. It's just kind of one of those things where if you're angry, you can usually come up with a specific reason. Emotions come in 3 categories ultimately. The first would be joyful and affectionate emotions, the second, hostile emotions, and the third, sad and anxious emotions. When we talk about the joyful emotions, these could include emotions like happiness, love and passion, and liking. Within the category of hostile emotions, we see anger, contempt, disgust, jealousy, and envy. And then the third category, the sad and anxious emotions, include sadness and depression, grief, fear, and social anxiety. Emotions are multidimensional. So we mentioned this earlier as part of the definition. We see that there are multiple components that feed into how we interpret an emotion. First off, there are the physiological components. How do we react to an emotion in terms of our physiological response? We might see things like our heart rate, our breathing rate, our pupils dilating, our sweating or perspiring. We can see all of those change as a result of an emotion. So you can imagine when you get angry, your heart rate increases, you start breathing faster, you might sweat, you might get red in the face. These are all physiological responses. There's also the cognitive component where we automatically start to try to make sense of a reaction. We try to interpret where this reaction is coming from and what has triggered it. There's also the behavioral components that help us interpret emotions. So we have specific action tendencies in regard to emotions. And these are the kinds of actions that a particular emotion prompts us to take. It's our general reaction to an emotion. So we might be excited by something, and our immediate reaction is to maybe feel light in the chest and jump up and say yes or something like that, where we have those specific actions that are then associated or have been associated with that emotion. There are also social and cultural components to an emotion. So the type of society or culture that we come from may determine how we react to something based on how we're raised or what we are exposed to. So, on a cultural level, we can think about the types of animals that are eaten in terms of disgust as an emotion. If you're in the United States and you were served dog, on a cultural level, that's going to determine that you're going to have a much stronger emotional reaction and likely that of disgust and anger, where if you were in another country, in another culture, that's not going to be an issue. Culture and society can also influence our interpretation of rejection. So in the United States, because we are an achievement culture, we take failure or rejection very strongly. So it's going to determine how we react and what emotion is triggered when we feel that rejection. It also, the types of emotions that are valued also play into our emotional reaction. So if we look at some Asian cultures, they value peace, calm, tranquility. So they're going to ultimately lean towards those types of emotions as reactions to things because those are valued. There are a couple of words you want to familiarize yourself with in terms of emotional reaction, and those are valence and intensity. Emotions vary in valence and intensity, and when we talk about an emotion's valence, it's the positivity or negativity. Some emotional experiences are positive where others are negative. So we may look at fear as an emotion that has a negative valence because we don't enjoy feeling fearful. Where excitement may have a positive valence because we think of that as a positive emotion. And of course, that is going to be subjective because for me, fear has a positive valence because I enjoy experiencing fear because it gets my adrenaline going, etc. So valence is subjective. So is intensity. An emotion's intensity is its strength or magnitude. So some emotional experiences are strong and others are weak. So when we think about maybe a spectrum of an emotion's intensity, we may start on the lower end of the spectrum and say that we are annoyed. It's not a very intense emotion, but then maybe the next step up would be mad, and then even more so angry, and then even more so furious, outraged, etc. So we can see that broad range of intensity that an emotion, even though it's kind of the same idea, it's going to vary depending on how strongly we interpret it, how we interpret its intensity. Emotions come in primary and secondary forms. Primary emotions such as fear, joy, and surprise all have unique and distinct emotional experiences, where secondary emotions like jealousy, contempt, and remorse are ultimately composed of combinations of primary emotions. So jealousy is, in my opinion, we'll throw it out and say a combination of fear and anger. So we see how there's a combination or a mix of these primary emotions. Some emotions are also meta emotions. So an example would be feeling embarrassed by your jealousy. Let's say you're jealous that your significant other keeps getting phone calls from an ex, and you can't stop yourself from being jealous of this, but then you start to feel embarrassed because you can't control your reaction, your jealous reaction. Another example would be feeling excited by your fear. That's me for sure. Another would be feeling surprised that someone else wasn't angry. So a meta emotion can be an emotion that's tied to a lack of response or a response that we don't expect as well. Meta emotions definitely help us understand and reflect on the emotions that we or others are experiencing or not experiencing. Culture and cultural background can affect the experience and expression of emotion. It seems like every chapter we talk about how these influence, how culture and gender influence whatever it is we're talking about. Here we might consider geography and how it affects emotional expressiveness. There's actually been research that's taken place that says people in warmer climates are typically more expressive. And this is because when you live in a warmer climate, it's warm and it makes your skin relax, and it ultimately allows people to have a heightened sensitivity to things. Therefore, they experience emotion on a more intense level than those of us who live in colder climates and don't necessarily experience it as heightened. Co-cultures sometimes differ in emotional behavior as well, so you might consider how members of a theater group may be potentially more expressive than members of an athletic club, because by nature, by virtue, that theater group, they specialize in being more expressive and ultimately having more of that intense emotional behavior. Expression is affected by display rules as well. Display rules are social norms for how emotions should be expressed, and they're codes that govern the ways that people manage and express emotions. We're taught not to throw fits and get angry in the middle of a restaurant or a grocery store or what have you. So we're taught to ultimately de-intensify, and we have these little unwritten rules. Some of them we actually learn as young children, but they all determine what is ultimately acceptable in terms of an emotional reaction. There are 5 display rules specifically. The first one is intensification. So this one is where we would exaggerate an emotion. So we may act overjoyed to see someone when we're only somewhat happy. We feel like that person is expecting us to feel extremely excited and overjoyed that they're there. So that's how we react, because we have that little display rule that's ingrained in us. Another one is de-intensification, obviously the opposite. This is where you're going to downplay an emotion. So an example would be, maybe we're feeling extremely angry at a friend for saying something or doing something, but we only act slightly irritated because we don't want to jeopardize the friendship or escalate the conflict, etc. Simulation is another display rule. This is acting like you feel an emotion. So acting overjoyed to see someone when you're not. So putting on airs, simulating that emotion. Another display rule is inhibition. This is where you might act indifferent about something or someone, or act as if you aren't actually feeling an emotion. So an example here would be not acting jealous about a flirtation that's taking place between your significant other and someone else, when really you are. You don't want to show them that you're jealous, because that's one of those emotions that we're supposed to feel guilty about, or that aren't acceptable in a relationship. You're supposed to feel comfortable, blah, 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 blah. So we may inhibit our emotion in order to act accordingly, or at least act in the way that we think that we should, or that we've been programmed to do. And then the final one is masking. This is where you express one emotion when you actually feel another. So an example could be acting happy for someone because they get a job, but you applied for the job too, you didn't get it, so you actually feel jealous, but they're your friend or they're somebody that you know, etc. So you act as if you're happy. All right, when we talk about technology in terms of emotion, technology and computer-mediated communication can affect emotion. First of all, because there is that relative lack of nonverbal signals that are available to us. We can use emojis, but we've talked before about how there is that very real possibility that they could be misinterpreted or they don't really have much of an impact. Another aspect of this is the fact that there is a lot of opportunity for sharing emotion. Oftentimes people feel more comfortable sharing emotions with others, and then the other person becomes more involved in that other person's emotion. So there's a lot more opportunity for these types of conversations to take place. As I mentioned, people feel a lot more at ease bringing things up when it's not a face-to-face type of communication. Emotional contagion affects experience and expression when we talk about emotion. So ultimately, at the core of emotional contagion, we see that people tend to mimic the experiences and expressions of others. So if you are feeling sad and you're crying and your friend is with you, there is a very good likelihood that that person will start to mimic that behavior, and they in turn will feel sad. And it's the type of, ultimately it's an empathic response when you look at the root of it. But it can happen with almost all emotions where we see someone behaving, especially if it's a very intense emotion, or if there is a very strong negative or positive valence, there's going to be that emotional contagion that can take place. Emotional contagion can happen both face-to-face and in online environments. It doesn't matter. Again, because people have the empathic response, and it's kind of that crowd mentality too, where you kind of glom on to what others are doing, and that's going to be the appropriate response in that particular setting. The influence of sex, especially when we talk about jealousy. Sex and gender roles influence both the experience and expression of emotions. Some research shows that sex differences in jealousy specifically stand out. They find that men are more likely to experience sexual jealousy rather than emotional jealousy, where women are the opposite. They are more likely to experience emotional jealousy. And furthermore, when we talk about expressiveness, androgynous people are more emotionally expressive than highly masculine individuals. And then we see that traditionally masculine individuals generally don't express emotions of vulnerability, especially. I believe this has come up before. We talk about how men are kind of programmed to avoid, emotions like weakness or frustration, things that make them appear weak. There are 3 personality dimensions that have the potential to affect how you experience emotion. The first one is agreeableness. This is the tendency to be pleasant, accommodating, and cooperative. And people that are agreeable tend to be happier on the whole and also better at managing their stress and emotions. There is also extroversion. This is the tendency to be sociable and outgoing. These people tend to be happier on average. And then another dimension is neuroticism. This is the tendency to think negative thoughts about the self, and these people generally experience more negative emotions on the whole, and they don't know how to manage them as well. So when we talk about managing emotions, we can talk about emotional intelligence. This can influence emotional experience and expression as well. It's the ability to perceive an emotion and express it, and to use that emotion to facilitate thought and emotional growth. So the awareness of an emotion, the ability to look at it, evaluate it, and use it to grow and modify the way that you approach a situation, rather than being completely oblivious to it and not knowing how to use that particular emotion. Alexithymia is a disorder that inhibits the ability to understand and describe emotions. If I'm not mistaken, it is ultimately related to or even on the autism spectrum. In order to actually sharpen your emotional communication skills, you have to start by identifying emotions. So listen to your body, look at those different components, those reactions, etc. Pay attention to your thoughts. As you're experiencing the emotion, pay attention to the self-talk that you're hearing or that you're aware of. That's the non-vocal internal monologue that is our process of thinking. So that little voice inside our head that we hear, I'm doing air quotes, as we're thinking about an emotional situation and others. Take stock of the situation, respect its context, understand where things and people are coming from. Learn to reappraise negative emotions. Emotional reappraisal is the process of changing how one thinks about a situation that gave rise to a negative emotion so that the effect of the emotion is diminished. So I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but ultimately our brains are lazy. They get into habits. Our brains have habits, they have ways of immediately reacting to a situation or what have you. And it's that whole idea of training your brain. Our brains are trained to have a specific reaction to an emotion based on previous experiences. So if every time we see somebody on their phone and we think that it might be an ex, and we automatically become jealous, it's because over time we have trained our brain to think that if somebody is on their phone and they won't tell us who it is, then it must be a bad thing, therefore we're jealous. So it's kind of the immediate trigger that says, okay, texting equals jealousy. We need to stop our brain from going there immediately. So we need to look at the situation and try to retrain our brain to come up with an emotional reaction that is no longer negative. We have to train it to think of something that is neutral, positive would be even better. But that's the whole process of emotional reappraisal. You also want to accept responsibility for your emotions. You're the one that has the reaction. No one is the cause of the emotion. And then also separate your emotions from your actions. So if when you're angry, your initial reaction or your action behavior is to lash out and possibly, engage in physical violence, obviously not a good thing. So you want to try to remove that emotion from that action. All right. So there I am. That was chapter 8. And if you guys have any questions, as always, please let me know, and make sure that you review your textbook so you get a little bit more information. And of course, anytime there are questions, issues, concerns, please don't hesitate to let me know. And I hope everybody's well, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.